Okay, today's focus is going to be on speciation and the fact that evolution can lead to changes in a new species. So one of the things that we're mainly going to focus on or try to keep in mind is our effect on the gene pool. When we have one gene pool, genetic differences in that gene pool will eventually lead to phenotypic differences in the population. And these phenotypic differences, how do they look, how can they act, can lead to a new species. So that's the general idea or kind of like overarching idea of what's going to happen or what we're going to discuss in this section of notes. So, the first question for you guys is, how does variation lead to new species? Well, before you even are able to answer that question, you have to think of, what is a species? A species is going to be defined generally as a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce viable and fertile offspring. So a couple things there. First, they must be able to interbreed. Once they're able to interbreed, they must be able to produce a viable offspring. Has to actually survive, not just the physical breeding. Then that offspring, once it has reached reproductive maturity, must be fertile and be able to have offspring of its own. When you're thinking of species and new species and speciation is the arrival of these new species. You also need to keep in mind that often they'll have the same or have a particular chromosome number. So we're going to really look at a lot of different mechanisms for speciation, for a new species to have evolved from an ancestral species. And what you're seeing in this first image is these 4 different types of snakes. These 4 snakes live in different areas along the eastern coast or the eastern side of the United States. These 4 snakes are actually going to be considered to be 4 subspecies. They are related, however, they are subspecies because they never actually interact with each other. This is going to be due to geographic isolation. The fact that they are divided in different areas, which means if they never interact and they're separated by geography, by land, then really it's going to be highly unlikely to be able to interbreed. So even though there's a potential that they could produce possibly some viable offspring, it's not likely to happen because of their different locations and because the fact that they are separated by geography, by land, by different conditions. So this is actually one way in which we can have some variation in the species and lead to different species. If these snakes are separated for long enough, let's say they came from an ancestral species that got separated and moved to these different areas. If they stayed separated enough, there is the possibility that the genetic differences of the survivors will lead to an increase in the phenotypic differences, and eventually these 4 could become completely different species. At the bottom here, we're looking at one of the first examples that we saw with variation leading to speciation, or the rise of a new species. And oftentimes you'll see this happening with a common ancestor, and that's what we really focus on. What you see here are finches, and with the finches you had a common ancestor that came from mainland South America. What happened is when these finches arrived to the Galapagos Islands, Galapagos Islands had some very diverse conditions. I'll go ahead and tell you now that this is called adaptive radiation. And so, what happened? We had ancestors that live in diverse conditions. The variants in that group diverge as they specialize to their conditions. This led to an accumulation of all of that, led to an accumulation of adaptations, and eventually led to a new species. So let's talk about that really quick. What does that mean? When this ancestral finch, a group of them, a population, moved into the Galapagos Islands, each area of the island had some very different conditions, and mainly in this case based on the food availability, whether or not that be seeds or insects or other plants. And because of the different conditions, the variation among that common ancestor separated, they diverged, they moved off into different subgroups as they specialized to their conditions, such as having a larger beak. Well, you moved to the area with these larger nuts. There was less competition there for you to break up the shell and be able to eat the seeds that were available. With a smaller beak, maybe this made you more able to dig out for certain bugs. So you moved to that area. It allowed you to have less competition, more food. And as they specialized to the condition, found a niche in the area in which they were at, accumulations of their adaptations occurred. When you see the word adaptation, however, you need to remember that an adaptations are inherited traits that increase your survival. And that means they increase the likelihood of your reproducing or reproduction. Okay, I'm kind of squishing that in there. So this is the first kind of mechanism of speciation, which is adaptive radiation. You can kind of see how that happens. Adaptive radiation or radiate, usually involves some sort of circle, a spreading out. So we're starting from a center, and because of the adaptations, we're going to spread out to these different areas, to these different niches that allow us to be successful. On the next page, we're going to look at a few more patterns. The first is known as allopatric populations. Again, these patterns are going to lead to speciation. In allopatric populations, what's going to happen is that you are going to be separated geographically. Or by space. Because you're being separated by space, you can not interbreed due to that condition. And then over generations, this can lead to variety, which leads to new species. Examples of this, and this is a form of, you can also think of this as geographic isolation, that first example that we talked about with the snakes. Examples could be the actual Grand Canyon, separating a species of squirrel, mountain ranges, rivers, lava. These are all things that could separate one species and eventually lead to new species. When you're looking at the word itself, allo means other, and then patrick means place. So they are in other places, and this is what leads to the new species. Over here you actually have a picture of geographic isolation, a species of beetle. There's a river that actually ends up separating them in the middle here, and eventually you can see the two separate locations give rise to different species of beetle. The next pattern is known as sympatric populations. And sympatric, we're going to break down this word again. Sym means the same. And again, patrick means place. So in this case, your organism or your population is still in the same area. However, what happens is that your gene flow is reduced due to specialization. So this is going to be a little different from what we saw earlier with the finches. With the finches, we saw the adaptive radiation, and so you moved into these different areas, these different groups, and once you moved into those different areas, the changes accumulated and you continued to spread out. Kind of a spiral or spiderweb effect, okay? That's what adaptive radiation is about. However, in sympatric populations, you're going to see something kind of similar in the fact that you do have kind of different niches. So, here's an example. We're going to go with an example. In an example, a group of insects can camouflage in different areas. And because they are in those different areas, they only interact with the similar organisms. So nothing's forcing them to stay away from each other. It's not like a river came between them and separated them. But these, let's say, using this picture down here, these darker beetles moved to an area where it was darker landscape, and so they were able to hide better. So because they're staying in that same area, they're going to interact with each other. The lighter ones are maybe going to move to the leaves of a tree, and so they're going to hide amongst the leaves. They're both living maybe on the same tree. However, the ones that are on the bark, where it's darker, are going to interact with each other, and the ones on the leaves, and they hide better there, are going to interact with each other. So you're just really exploiting. Sometimes you can see this, or you'll hear this called as exploiting niches. A niche, a job, a place in the ecosystem, and this is going to lead to you just only associate or mate with similar organism within that same location. Okay? Below here, these are some other methods or mechanisms for continuing that reproductive isolation. In all of these cases, we've separated them one way or another and haven't allowed them to mate with each other. So these are additional mechanisms for reproductive isolation. So we've broken them up into two major groups. The first is pre-zygotic and the second is post-zygotic. So before you actually mate and sperm and egg join together, and after fertilization.
All right, at this time, all students in the 900 hall, the 200 hall, and 500 hall are dismissed to the gym. I want to say before everyone leaves, make sure you bring your book bags with you, bring your belongings with you. We will be dismissing from the second pep rally for those students that will be in attendance of that second pep rally. So bring all of your stuff with you to the gym if you're coming from the 900 hall, the 200 hall, and the 500 hall.
I'm going to jot down a few quick notes, and I want you guys to just copy it down, and we'll discuss it in class later. And we'll talk about some examples in class as well.